Noah built the ark out of gopher wood. The flood it came and the ark it stood. And Noah's ark's a moving, a moving, a moving. And Noah's ark's a moving, a moving along. Who built the ark? Now who built the ark? Oh, Noah, my Lord. Noah's ark's a moving, a moving, a moving. Noah's ark's a moving along. He marched the animals 2 by 2, the hippopotamus and the kangaroo. And Noah's ark's a moving, a moving, a moving. Noah's ark's a moving along. Who built the ark? Now who built the ark? Oh, Noah, my Lord. Noah's ark's a moving, a moving, a moving. Noah's ark's a moving along.
I'm Bob Crawford.
And I'm Chris Breslin.
And this is RTN Theology. This is the Holy Week edition.
Holy Week edition, yeah.
And Chris, as we are approaching, this will air on Maundy Thursday.
That's right.
And that is when we commemorate the Last Supper. And I was reading in Luke last night, in between Jesus' entrance into Jerusalem, his triumphal entrance on the donkey into Jerusalem, and in between that and the Last Supper, there's a Luke 20. There's a chapter that's kind of always intrigued me, and it's bedeviled me also as well. And this is the chapter for those of you out there that haven't read the whole of Luke, where it's in Luke 20, Luke 20:19 is where Jesus talks about paying taxes to Caesar. Right. And that's the famous line that I think people who are not of the faith and people who don't read the Bible, that will ring a bell for them. But in the beginning of Luke 20, there are a couple passages that have kind of intrigued me, and I don't feel like I have a great handle on what the intent is, and specifically the parable of the wicked tenants, which is Luke 20, starts at verse 9. And it culminates in this quote from the Old Testament. I believe this is right, Chris. The stone that the builders rejected has become the cornerstone.
Yeah, that's from Psalm 118. And traditionally, that's a liturgical psalm that we'll read on Palm Sunday. You know, Jesus entering into Jerusalem, being the place of the temple, and the cornerstone talk is certainly about building the temple, which is exactly what Jesus starts to threaten here in this parable. So,
but going back to the beginning,
yeah.
But this begins at Luke 20 verse 9. It's the parable of the wicked tenants, and Jesus tells a parable about a man who planted a vineyard.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, thanks a lot for opening up this parable. This is a really hard one.
Well, that's why I struggle with this. I'm trying to understand this, and just I'm sure everyone out there knows it's every would you call it a pericope?
Sure.
Is also connected to what comes before it and what comes after it. So just before this one, Jesus is teaching in the temple and preaching the gospel, and the chief priests and the scribes challenge him on who John the Baptist was.
Mm-hmm.
Just before that.
Yeah.
And then he goes into this parable about this man who owns a vineyard.
Yeah. Well, a couple of things, and Bob just kind of sprung this on me. So, but
not while we were recording.
Yeah, while I was in seminary, I took a class on Luke, and our professor made us read Luke in one sitting all the way through several times before the course even started, and then at least once a week, every week of the semester-long course. And the goal was, like Bob said, to see these connections and to feel the whole, and to have the whole like narrative drama unfold before you, because Luke is a master storyteller. And so there are all these tensions and all these ironies and all these revelations that are set up earlier and then that unfold in front of you. And so, yeah, the question of authority doesn't come out of nowhere. the tension related to Jesus's identity for Jews, but also opening up the accessibility of being God's people to Gentiles and beyond Jews has been there the whole time, even from the opening genealogy that goes back to Adam. Matthew's genealogy goes back to Abraham, so it's a very Jewish rooted, maybe even in some good ways, a nationalistic gospel. Luke's is more of a universal gospel, opening up the ability to participate in God to the whole of the human race. So that's there from the beginning, and you're meant to see that. Before we started recording, Bob was talking about how he is in this history course, and last week dedicated this really condensed week of study to Hitler and Nazi Germany. This passage, as you might imagine, has a really awful history of being interpreted and used anti-Semitically, that Jesus is one who is condemning the Jews. Verse 19 says, the legal experts and chief priests wanted to arrest him right there because they knew he had told this parable against them. And so, it's definitely in some sense against them, but not all Jews. These Jewish leaders who are manipulating, who are closing down the faith in order to control and wield power, and Jesus is subverting that, and not with outright declarations, as some revolutionaries might, not with violence, but with these stories that, a really good story has the ability to crack open something, and those are the sorts of stories that Jesus tells.
Do I need to read it? Doesn't I'll read it, and then the pastor describes it.
Yeah, sure. Well, the story after is the render unto Caesar what is Caesar's, and that's become a really ubiquitous saying, right? And mostly a way to try to avoid taxes, right? But there are all these little cultural clues there that make that an even more powerful statement. And again, a statement back to creation, back to the beginning with Adam and Eve being made into the image of God. And so they would have handed Jesus a coin, and Jesus shows them the image on the coin that it's likely Caesar's head, the way we have Lincoln on the penny and our president, like any good empire, we have our leaders' heads on our coins minted, and they would have had Caesar's head on the coin, and Jesus, takes the coin that they flip to him, and they're trying to trap him into making seditious claims or making antinomian claims, right? And he just says, look at this coin, whose image is on that. Give it back to the person whose image is on it. But the more subtle thing that he's saying, he says, give to Caesar what's Caesar's and give to God what's God's. The more subtle claim in there that I don't think I'm reading too much into it, and several experts and scholars read this also, is by saying give to God what's God's. He's saying look at what is imprinted with God's image, namely human beings, and offer that to God. So basically undercutting and subverting the idea of empire and taxes being the all in all, and saying this is an invitation to give your whole life and your whole self above and beyond taxes. Give those to God, because God has claim over all this. Caesar has claim over this piddly little empire that's going to fall, and God has claim over all of creation.
And so going back to just after that quote about the stone that the builders rejected has become the cornerstone, and then in verse 18 it says, everyone who falls on that stone will be broken to pieces, and when it falls on anyone, it will crush him. And so what you're saying is, again, putting your faith in the piddly empire, so to speak, like the world of here. If you give yourself to the world of here, you will vanish with the world of here. You will be crushed with the world of here, because that will be crushed. This empire will be crushed eventually, because all empires are crushed eventually.
in some sense, God's going to give you exactly what you want, and the smallest thing you can set your sights on is anything that is not God. I love that really pithy phrasing from the psalm. The stone the builders rejected has become the chief cornerstone. Is, the least likely start of something that will last represents Jesus here, rather than this like sure slab foundation of the things that are going to pass away. And this is really threatening. You might imagine to a religious authority who is kind of in league in concert with the empire, like the Roman Empire, with this like Pax Romana ethos of we're going to let religious practice exist in a way that keeps the peace, is pretty cozy, the religious authority. So, come Friday, in which we remember Jesus's death on the cross, it's a death that is ultimately driven by the religious elites. Again, not all Jews.
Right, and we don't even have to think about this as it being a Jewish thing. This is just the religious authorities who cozy up for their own survival with whatever the secular ruling authority is.
Yeah,
so this is just an example of this is what happened in Jesus's time. This is the danger of all religious, if you want to say religious elite, which just kind of sounds like a paradox in a way.
Well, it's in some sense, in a place like America, these questions are embedded into our very existence, right? Like the founding fathers anticipate some of these things from their own context and put in things like separation of church and state. And oftentimes that is, I think, probably more not to sully the state than not to sully the church. But
that's from what Roger Williams thought. Yes.
Yeah. But from the religious side of the fence, I also appreciate that too. However, how that manifests itself culturally isn't always that tidy or that clear. And we see, especially in this era of increasing like post-Christendom, we see these areas of rub, and it's often for Christians and people of faith, at times it can feel quite uncomfortable, as if some of these things are falling apart. But, this idea that the stone the builders rejected has become the chief cornerstone, and it becomes the place where we either feel like we're amidst rubble, or we feel like we're at the beginning of a really lasting and durable building project, even as we're kind of being dismantled from some of the things that have been comfortable and good for us.
So fitting. So tell us about the guest you had this week.
Yeah, I got a chance to speak to a guest that I've had on my wish list to talk to for quite some time. Her name's Kelly Nikondeha, and she's an author. She lives part-time in Arizona and part-time in Burundi with her husband and family. And I knew about Kelly because she wrote a book about adoption that you'll hear in the interview. I'm personally invested in. My father-in-law was adopted, and I'm the adoptive parent of my youngest son, Simeon. And it's an amazing book. It's a book that I bought. I looked it up because it's like $2 on Kindle right now. And when I brought it up on my Amazon, it says like, you have bought 5 copies of this item. Would you like more? And, but Kelly came out with a even more recent book called Defiant. And it is about what the women of Exodus can teach us about freedom. I think you'll hear Kelly's amazing biblical imagination, her really sharp and keen understanding about what was going on in the world of Exodus, but also what that means for us now. It was a really a great joy to get to interview her. Unfortunately, it was just her and I, because during this time, Bob had some family responsibilities that just came up. But
We had
it was a great time.
non-virus related illnesses. We had other viruses.
I wasn't going to say it. I feel like every time you cough, you have to justify yourself. So
it is. And we're in the South, so the pollen is just crazy. So you don't know what you're dealing with half the time. But
and we'll have music today from Mac Metter. I've never gotten to meet Mac, but he is a church worship leader in Austin, Texas, and he put out a Lenten EP and is coming out with an Easter one that he's letting us preview one of the songs from that Easter EP, and I love what he's doing down there in an amazing music city.
Before we get on with the interview, I'd like to just mention our good friends at La Cosecha Coffee. Jamie Jeske and his family, they're shipping out coffee. They're selling online through this time where they had to close their coffee shop, but they're still roasting and sending out coffee. And if you'd like to support him and his family and his mission, we sure would appreciate that. The website is La Cosecha, LACOSECHA coffee.com. We just love Jamie. He's been a great supporter of ours over the years, and we would just love for you guys to support him by buying a bag of coffee. It's really good coffee. He's got one here on the website today, the Columbia Caturra Honey. That is a medium roast with notes of red apple, cherry, caramel, and tangerine. That just sounds really nice. And if you're like me, you're drinking a lot of coffee these days.
The world will keep on spinning and the birds will keep on singing when I'm gone. Oh, and the sun will go on rising and its grandeur mesmerizing when I'm gone. Oh, and the south wind blows its course but comes around back to the north and when I'm gone, with no remembrance of the former things. In the end, all's been heard. Fear your God, keep his word.
I'm here today with Kelly Nikondeha, author of Defiant, What the Women of Exodus Teach Us About Freedom. And I was so excited to get the chance to have this conversation with Kelly. I was just telling her that I have been a fan for a long time, first by her book on adoption, The Sacrament of Belonging in a Fractured World, that she put out in 2017. It was very personally important to me because we adopted our fourth son in 2017. And her ability to dive into the scriptural language around sacrament, and also just the theological depth of what is going on in that really rich scriptural and narrative activity. It was just beautiful for us. So we bought copies for everyone that's even mentioned adoption around us, and I'm sure we'll talk a little bit more about adoption as we go. But Kelly, our podcast is a sister podcast to The Road to Now, and RTN means Road to Now, and everyone has their own Road to Now, and you have a really rich and interesting Road to Now. Share with our listeners a little of how you come to us today.
Well, thank you for having me today. Yes, let me think about my road to where I am now. It feels like it was quite a unexpected journey. So I am an adopted person myself, adopted into a predominantly white evangelical middle-class family in Southern California. And along the way, ended up meeting a gentleman from Burundi Now, the first time I heard the word Burundi was when he told me where he was from. And I had no idea. Is that a region? Is that a city? I was so embarrassed. So if you don't know where Burundi is, you are in good company. But it's a small country in the heart of East Africa. So my husband grew up in the heart of extreme poverty, less than $1 a day kind of poverty. And he was the most opposite person I had ever met in terms of where we came from and our worldview, in the sense of how we were shaped by the socio-political and the economical worlds that we grew up in, et cetera. And, marrying him was a huge curve in my journey in terms of helping me to see things about myself and my own culture that I had never seen before. So that bicultural and what has become a bicontinental marriage really was significant in helping me see and understand my American exceptionalism, to come to different understandings of the dynamics of colonization and how that has affected people around the world, especially in Africa, of course. And so that was really significant for my development. We adopted 2 babies from Burundi, and so my experience of family is bookended with the story of adoption. And along the way, I started to recognize that at heart, I'm a liberation theologian. The stories of liberation are so compelling and just ubiquitous from beginning to end in our text or in our holy book that at some point I couldn't resist naming the thing that is really the lens through which I see and understand scripture. And so I write from that place. I grew up in evangelicalism, as I said, but my journey began in the Catholic Church. And I am grateful to Phyllis Tickle for gifting us the word of Mother Church before she passed. Because when she said that, I was in a room where she was speaking, and the minute she named it, I knew that was the way to talk about my connection to the Catholic Church. It didn't make sense any other way, but the minute she said it, it was like, yes, just the way we often have complicated relationships, but deeply loving and significant relationships with our mother. That is how I felt about the Catholic Church. And so I have, in the last set of years, found it to be the safest place for me to worship and experience the sacraments. So that's a bit of my journey that brings me to you this morning.
No, that's great. I resonate with a bit of that, having grown up in the Catholic Church and I guess having left. I don't know that I even necessarily describe having left the Catholic Church, even as I'm a pastor of a Protestant non-denominational church, right? But I love the part in the book that you reflecting back on your back on Catholicism, I guess maybe moving you back towards the Catholic Church, is that you said, I missed Mary and her Magnificat. I love that. My experience also, a lot of people, and it's true to some extent, look at the Catholic Church as this very patriarchal place, but I was taught the faith by nuns, and
yes.
And
yes.
and nuns ran the parish, period.
As women often do.
Yeah, that's right. So you describe yourself as a liberation theologian. What does that mean to you? And what maybe were some of your introductions? Because I feel like being in an evangelical Californian church, that's not exactly the hotbed of liberation theology.
Exactly. It really did take me a while to own what was evident to everybody around me. I remember when I finally said it out loud, my friends in my writing group, who are my intimate friends, were all like, well, we've known that, like, this is no surprise. But growing up in the evangelical church in Southern California, nobody talked about liberation. That was not a word I heard growing up. And I went to seminary at Fuller Theological Seminary and graduated in '99. So that's about the time that I was there. And there were many great things that I encountered at Fuller. Liberation theology was not one of them. Occasionally it was mentioned, but it was always mentioned in the context of what liberation theology looked like in the 70s in Latin America. They talked about its intersection with communism. So it was always a very cursory, negative, all these negative connotations about liberation theology. And there was a period of time where even the Catholic Church disowned
Yeah, sure. Right.
that because liberation theology did kind of have its, it grew up in the soil of Latin America. And we talk about people like Gustavo Gutierrez and Leonardo Boff and others who the church said, no, we don't own that until Pope Francis came along and had a different perspective. And I wonder if him being from Latin America and seeing some of the things he saw maybe helped him have a different perspective. But in any event, I was never instructed to read any liberation theologians in my seminary journey. And it was only, I think, after my time in Burundi. I lived in Burundi. I lived back and forth between the two places, and living in a developing country where you still see the vestiges of colonization and its effects, both in the church and in the culture and in the landscape. I was looking for other language, and that connected with the things I was starting to see in the text. I think Jubilee was the final thing for me. Was, as Luke tells the story, the first time we hear Jesus preach is in a synagogue where he pulls out that Isaiah scroll and he reads this piece that we now call the Jubilee piece about, we say Jubilee, right? The year of God's favor.
Yeah.
But really what Jesus did was he went right to the economic policy of the Old Testament, because Jubilee was about actual economics. It was about indebtedness, land rights, labor, and getting your actual freedom back.
Yeah.
And Jesus uses this as the metaphor that he uses to announce, this is what I'm about. And it's starting now, today, with me. And I just think you can't start there and not recognize that freedom isn't just freedom for the soul.
Yeah.
It is freedom also for the body and how we experience the world. And Jesus knew that indebtedness was one of the, my husband, I remember the first time we studied that together, and he said, man, there would have been no better news for my dad. And his dad was a church planter for 40 plus years. Most of the time he was paid in chickens and mangoes because there was no money to pay him.
Right.
He's like, there would have been no better news for my dad than to hear his debts were forgiven. That really would have been good news. And I think that's where I really started to kind of that marriage between what material.
Yeah. Do you feel like, because that seems like a really drastically different starting point than most of like the evangelical gospel, and it's bizarre to say evangelical gospel because that's like saying gospel, like. But
I know what you mean.
Yeah, but the evangelical gospel would read about that sort of deliverance or liberation, or you use the language of freedom, and it's our hearts and our souls being liberated charitably from sin and death. But the logical consequence to that doesn't seem to be like economic justice, right? Perhaps sometimes, like I've seen that in some evangelical communities that they get to their justice by means of a very kind of personal gospel. Have you seen it the other way though? Like that people start with this economic good news and very like concrete social good news, and then get to the sort of kind of evangelical gospel of personal freedom. And because I feel like the people that will read this book or read liberation theologians, like in some sense they will nod their head, but they'll say like, you've missed the primary thing, at least to me, I just wondered if you've seen that or experienced that, maybe especially in different contexts than you've grown up in.
Well, I think body and soul work together.
Yeah.
So maybe that's another piece, is that for me I've grown up learning that they're just they're inextricable. They belong together.
Yeah.
And that I just grew up in a tradition that really only spoke to one, and that was the only lens that my community used to understand salvation in the Bible.
Mm-hmm.
And for me, it felt like a completion to recognize that, oh, of course, we also needed to be, yes, our souls were saved, and also Jesus did talk to poor people who were oppressed by the empire of their day.
Mm-hmm.
About actual, food insecurity and indebtedness and violence. Of course, to me, it just made sense. But it's interesting when you're in Burundi, they have been so shaped, their theological imagination has been so shaped by the missionaries that came with the colonizers, that sadly, it's even for them, sometimes you have to remind them, because often religion becomes an escape.
Yeah.
Jesus is just going to, this is what my husband grew up with. Jesus is going to come and save us. So your poverty doesn't matter.
Yeah.
Ignore it. And yet, to me, it just seems so odd, but often we have to help them see that, well, all of this is in our story. So.
Yeah. It strikes me as a really strange post-colonial time that we're in, and that we're starting to hear ourselves back to us. It's almost like going back to the future or something like that, and so like I'm very keen to hear some of these Global South voices in how they're interpreting ourselves back to us. Like Emmanuel Katangale uses the term the mirror to the church,
Yes.
and I don't know if that's exactly what he meant with that, but that's kind of what I'm seeing and kind of hoping for, and hoping that we're brave enough to and patient enough to listen to. But so your book, Defiant, first off, I love how fierce the cover, the whole Erdman's really did well with this. Like,
we worked very hard to get the right cover image.
That's good. And we've spoken to female authors on this show, and just I know enough people who have written, and it seems like a persistent difficulty for female authors to not have like floral, pretty, like kind of female oriented covers, like very, very caricaturized, right?
Right, bikes with baskets and birds, and I was
exactly.
like, none of that.
And so I don't for a minute think that this is like a book for women. It might be a book about women, but it doesn't strike me as a book exclusively for women. But you detail the women of the Exodus story. And when I got this book from your publicist a few weeks back, I was at the dentist. It was right at the beginning of the virus stuff, and so everyone was like kind of keeping their hands to themselves. But the dental hygienist is, I had my mouth wide open, and she saw the book sitting on the chair, and she says, "What are you reading?" And I kind of just pointed, and I'm in North Carolina, so everyone has known the Bible at some point, right?
Okay.
And she says, "Oh, the women of Exodus," and she says, "Who were they?" So
this is the challenge, right?
and so you go through and you seek to dive into these stories of the women in Exodus. Exodus, of course, is the narrative about freedom from captivity, freedom for life with God. And I love some of the names that you pull out. I was like, oh, I didn't know that person had a name. And I think I'm not alone, right?
Right.
But you call them the hidden figures of the liberation movement.
Exactly.
I love that. Tell me about that idea or how you came to be with some of these characters, how they became important to you.
Well, I always, from the days of catechism, sitting in, the fellowship hall at St. Nicholas Parish, the Moses story was always one that caught my attention. And I think initially it was just because Moses and I were both adopted. So I recognized in his story some of the things I saw. He had two mothers. I have two mothers. And the fact that he was just this, liberation badass was just even better. I was like, oh, I love this guy. Even from a young age, I found his story so compelling. Working on the first book, Adopted, what I found in the Moses story was that this was the archetype, the biblical archetype of an adoptive family. It's the one time I feel like we get a really good picture of a birth family and their struggles and what relinquishment looked like in that context. Um, Explored a little bit what the adoptive parent, what that role looks like. We see the adopted child, but then we even get a glimpse of Moses as an adopted adult and wrestling with and coming to terms with his dual identity as both Hebrew and Egyptian, and that becomes something that God empowers and uses to liberative good. Can you imagine Moses standing at the burning bush and not knowing that he was Hebrew, not having that connection to that part of himself? And so, I think spending a lot of time with his two mothers in that work, his birth mother, who the text will belatedly tell us her name is Jochebed, and then his adoptive mother, who tradition tells us her name is Bethia, one of Pharaoh's daughters. And I got into the thick of it with them, but then I think it was just a small step to then start to see that there were other women in the story and to really pay attention to what they were doing. Combined with just, we were in Burundi and we do community development work there. And the women in one of our communities up in Matera, they were also part of helping me see what I hadn't seen before. As I watched these 30 women come alongside their husbands. And I remember in the early days thinking the women came too soon. They're going to slow down the progress. I mean, I am so embarrassed to say now.
Sure.
But the truth is, when the men started working this pristine piece of land, I thought the women weren't going to come for months. And they came like a few weeks later. I'm like, it's too soon. It's going to. But I watched these women work, and they gave me a picture of what solidarity looks like and what the capacity they had to change their community. And not long into the project, when the men decided it's time to pick some new leaders, they picked some of the women, which is so against Burundian culture. You do not, just like this story in the Old Testament. This is a patriarchal society, and for them to just intuitively know that we need some of these women on our leadership structure, it was such a sign that even the community, even the men recognized the capacity of these women. But I also saw it, and I think the connection, the combination of being deep in the text, but also that Burundian context kind of helped me see, there are other women in this story. And what are they doing? And once you see them, you can't unsee them.
Breathe in all of your pain and aching, all of your lonely waiting. Nothing can separate you.
I see this project as not being some sort of like progressive moving forward project, as more of a recovery project of like looking back and actually seeing maybe for the first time something that was there all along, or some ones who were there all along. And I want to go back to the idea of relinquishment, because I think that's the chapter I've most read in the adoption book, and one of the most beautiful, but also one of, like, I've cried so many times reading that chapter.
I cried when I wrote it. That is the most tender chapter for me in that book.
Yeah. For those listening who haven't read that, you talk about Jochebed, and many of us have sung about the story of Moses being put in the pitch basket and put into the Nile River to be found. And his mom Jochebed is the one who does it, who lets him go. And this act of relinquishment is really ambiguous. Like, it's risky. Is she preparing him for death or preparing him for life?
Exactly.
And that seems to me just an icon for the whole shape of life with God. For us, life with God in Christ is, are we being prepared for death or life, or
Right.
life through death?
Well, and we're on the cusp of Holy Week,
That's
which,
it.
right, we don't know at the way of the cross that we're invited to follow. Is it about Good Friday or Easter Sunday?
Yeah.
At the time,
That's right.
nobody knew, right?
That's right. Say more a little bit about your personal exploration of relinquishment as someone who has been adopted, but also as someone who has adopted two sons. Just maybe your personal reflection on that.
Well, I think what I myself have never had a difficult time with the idea that my birth mother relinquished me. Some adopted children really struggle with that.
Yeah.
Some adopted people carry that pain their entire life. I just was not one of those. And I think when I was younger, I know when I was younger, I would look at people who struggled and think, oh, maybe they didn't have a good adoption story.
Yeah.
And then when I adopted my two children, one of them really, well, both of them in their own ways had to grapple with the loss of their birth parents. And I was like, wait a minute, I'm doing everything right. and they're still struggling with having lost that person in their life. And so it cracked me open to recognize that not all of our stories of adoption or of relinquishment are monolithic. They're not all the same. So when I studied the Exodus text, I think what I was able to see through Jochebed was that her relinquishment was connected to her deep love for her son. We're told early on when the baby is born, she looks at him and she calls him Tov, which is this beautiful word that harkens back to the creation story. And it was good. God made, the first day and it was good. And the second day it was good. And she looks at her son and says, all of creation goodness, I recognize in you. She loved her son. She saw his goodness, as I assume every mother does when she births a child for the most part. And yet she lived in the shadow of the brickyards where there was a death edict for boys like hers. And relinquishment was the most loving thing she could do in the face of an empire that was breathing down her neck, to take her son. And the story says that she put him. It's a very intentional word. It's a word we see actually used to describe what Hagar did with her son in the desert. She put him in a place. And again, not knowing, will he live or will he die? There is that ambiguity in the story. But she put him on this raft, this ark. And then she places him in the thicket of reeds. And I believe she knew where she was placing him. She knew there was a chance that this woman would see and maybe do something different. But in that story, the idea that she put him in this ark or this raft, and she ferried him across the Nile River, filled with crocodiles and hippos and all other manner of things. That fierce mother love, that I recognize. That relinquishment wasn't a abandonment, which was the word I heard growing up, that birth mothers abandoned their kids, that they were heartless, that they weren't good mothers, but to the contrary, if you really peel it back, so many of these women were dealing with injustices, whether it was economic injustice. And for my kids, my daughter lost both her parents to HIV/AIDS. They were too poor to get treatment. They were too poor to be able to have medication that would prevent the transmission of the disease from mother to daughter. I mean, And for my son, he was an orphan of poverty. They couldn't afford to keep him and feed him. So, right. But these are the kinds of injustices that usually push a woman, not always, but most often, to relinquish a child. And that allowed me to have so much more compassion. I mean, like I said, it was never my own challenge in my story, but it allowed me to talk about these women in a way and help my children talk about their moms in a way that it's like, yeah, they loved you, but this is what love looks like under duress. Sometimes love looks like letting go.
Yeah. Yeah. Our son is 2, so we haven't had those conversations yet. And I distinctly remember ahead of adopting Simeon, at that point, they're now 8'6", but at that point they were 6'4", siblings, older siblings. And thinking kind of with every kid, like, oh, I don't really know what I'm doing, but I will when it's time. God's going to give me knowledge. And actually at this point, I know how to raise a child up to 6, that's
right.
I've done that once, and I've done 4 years old twice, it's the sort of thing, like you're gaining some facility with those things. But and both of Simeon's birth parents are Black, and I just remember thinking with Simeon, in some sense, I will raise him like I know how to raise children up until this point, but I don't have everything I need here, and I won't. And some of that is I don't know. It's still taking me some realization. I guess the realization was like, because I don't have this, and my wife and I don't have this in and of ourselves. Like, it's going to take a community is going to be the gifts.
Yes.
And our willingness and work to cultivate that community around our son. And maybe that's how we should have been thinking all along, for our other children, for whom it's easier to feel like we can do this, and so I've seen that as not just receiving our son, who is every bit as much our son as our other children, as a gift from Simeon's birth mom, but also the gift of learning reliance and learning we need more than we have.
Well, the solidarity piece. I mean, I feel, people often talk about feeling threatened by the presence of a birth parent.
Yeah.
Now, I'm the product of a closed adoption, and of course, my children functionally are as well. Yeah. But a lot of people are quite afraid, and I remember when we started the process to adopt them, we were in a conversation with other adoptive parents at a class. Yeah. And we were all supposed to talk about why we picked adopting internationally from whatever country. And I was shocked. I shouldn't have been. But at that time, I was shocked that 70% of the people around that table said that the reason they chose international over domestic is because they didn't want any possibility of connection with birth parents. Mm-hmm. And as an adopted person, it was so hard to not get up and say, I got to preach to y'all, because these were all Christian families, and a lot of them came from the same church even. And I was like, okay, we need to have some theological conversation here before you enter into this. But that is a big fear for adoptive parents. But for me, I see it as a work of solidarity, that I'm just finishing.
That's right.
What these women would have started, and trying to honor the way that they would have wanted to mother my kids. But
I'm sure, having written a book on adoption, people come to you now and are like, "Oh, adoption, that's something we're interested in doing. We should do that." And and I don't know how you answer those questions, but us having adopted our son, and he being very obviously not coming from our genes, like a lot of people we know, but also people we don't know, will come up and be like, "Oh, adoption, that sounds great." And I'm very hesitant to like outrightly commend that, because it's so complicated, and I don't know that we're doing this right. We're doing it as right as we can, and we're praying
Right.
for forgiveness. But the idea that this is, easy and clean, and you can manipulate or control it is scary to me, that someone would think that was possible.
But that is how a lot of people,
Yeah.
especially coming out of Christian spaces, talk about adoption. And part of the reason I wrote that book was recognizing that the people who were writing and talking about the theological implications of adoption were all young white men.
That's right.
And they all had adopted children, within like their kids were maybe 4, 6, 8 when they wrote their books. And I remember reading some of them and I could not believe that they put some of these thoughts in print. Like, someday your kids are going to grow up and read this and be like, Dad, we have to have a talk if this is what you really believe. And at first I was very judgmental, like, holy crap.
Yeah.
And then I think maybe it's the tenderness of God that, wait a minute, they're only so many years into their adoption experience. You have 40 plus years, now 50 years in the company of the adopted. I have tenure and experience that they as young fathers just don't have yet. And so they're earnest and they're trying to pull together their best understanding theologically and what they know of raising an adopted child at 4, at 6, at 8, right? They're doing the best they can.
Yeah.
And so what I realized is that I just wanted to be able to contribute to that conversation from my perspective as an adopted person, as a mother, as a woman, and give different language to say, here's another way that we can have these conversations. Because we're all doing our best, and we're not all doing it perfectly. There is no such thing as perfect, but I just wanted to at least add to that conversation. And to your question about, I get a lot of people who want to know, should I adopt? And I actually think, I guess very much like if it's a sacrament, and if a priest has to go through ordination and be prepared and ask tough questions,
that's good. Yeah.
Right. Like if a priest really has to go through the rigors of a committee, helping them discern if this is right and asking those tough probing questions. And then I would say I have my own set of tough questions that I ask people.
Yeah.
Are you willing to really investigate your own privilege? Are you really able to do the work? Because raising somebody who's a different, if you're looking at international adoption, you better be doing your own work of decolonizing and naming the whiteness and the privilege you have and understanding how that dynamic's going to impact raising this child. And right. But and when you start talking that way, people are like, oh.
And even coming to the recognition of to some extent, like adoption, especially in Christian circles, is often a white rebranding of something that has existed for a long time in minority communities of like kinship adoption. And, it's the kids that I grew up at school and playing sports with that their cousins live with them. And like, what do you think that is if it's not some form of adoption, right? I love how these women in Exodus, I don't think they're just purely shibboleths for the various things that they uncover, but their stories really help us. And when you talk about privilege, you talk about the Pharaoh's daughter, and you talk about how she breaks through privilege. And I would just love using her story or digging into her story. How do you think that is done for majority Christians, adoptive parents?
Well, in this story, we see Bethia. Her name comes from Jewish tradition, so it's not actually in the text that we have, but it comes out of the Jewish canon, so to speak. And as we look at Bethia, she's most likely one of many of Pharaoh's daughters. And you would say that absolutely she has some measure of privilege. She's growing up in the courts of Pharaoh. She has a certain ease about her life. And I think it's very easy to look at her as that one-dimensional character. Woman of privilege, has everything she needs. Life is good for her. But as I leaned into the story, uh, you know, there's another daughter of Pharaoh that we see in Genesis, and that's Hagar. There's again a Jewish story, a tradition that Hagar was actually a daughter of Pharaoh,
Hmm.
in a different Pharaoh. And when Abraham and Sarah and she's my sister, no, she's not my sister, that whole incident, part of what Pharaoh does to send them away and try and make nice and, was he gave them one of his own daughters
Hmm.
as a servant. And so we have this story of a daughter of Pharaoh becoming a slave.
Hmm.
And do you think that that story would not have lived in the world of Pharaoh's daughters, that story wouldn't have been told, that these women wouldn't have known that we may be Pharaoh's daughters today, but we could be somebody's slave tomorrow if it
Yeah.
served our father's political purpose? I mean, so I guess I started to recognize that maybe this woman, to be in that position, was also precarious, that there were limits to that privilege. Uh, and that started to make sense to me, right? That this is a more complex
Yeah.
reality. And so I think about this woman, and I use my imagination in part of my exegetical process, which is another thing that some people love and some people really want to understand how I got there. But I imagine her walking down the beach or the shore of the Nile River, and one afternoon, and seeing a baby upside down, waterlogged, dead in front of her, at her feet. It was before Pharaoh's, men could come and take away the evidence. But she sees this child, and she would have, right? If there were a lot of babies, and we know that the Hebrews were prolific, there are a lot of babies, and they're coming down the Nile River. Chances are she would have seen one of them wash up at her feet. The evidence that this is what's happening, this is what my father is doing, what his economy, what his administration is doing. But what was she supposed to do? I imagine her feeling completely paralyzed in her privilege. Yes, I'm a daughter of Pharaoh. Yes, I have all the food I need and, relative ease, but I can't get an audience with him. I'm not even his favorite daughter. What can I do to change imperial policy? Feeling the angst of, yes, I have privilege, but there are limits, and feeling stuck in it. And it really was the two Hebrew women. It was Jochebed and her young daughter Miriam, who gave her an opportunity to get unstuck, because there would be another baby who would land in front of her at the river. But this baby was alive and crying, and she could do something about it. Now she had a decision, because she could do something with this baby. And these two women end up entrapping her, I think, in the most holy way, and giving her an opportunity to step out into the river with them. They gave her an invitation to get unstuck and to become part of this rescue operation with them.
Yeah.
And while that may not be the only way that women of privilege like myself get unstuck, I do think it is an important way that we can get unstuck. And I would say that was part of how it happened for me. It was my husband being from another part of the world, and having enough proximity to really challenge me and show me things and be in conversation with me. It was my Palestinian friend Tahani, who was my neighbor here in Arizona, and had a high-risk pregnancy. And as an immigrant, Muslim, brown Palestinian woman, she could not navigate our health system without help. And so early in our friendship, she pulled me in and needed my help. But that allowed me to see what I didn't see before, in terms of the way that our structures are hard for immigrants to navigate. And I started to learn how to be a real partner. But I needed her to kind of pull me out of the sidelines.
Yeah.
So I don't always want to say that the onus is on oppressed women or marginalized women to recruit those of us from the courts of Pharaoh. But I will say that oftentimes, I think that is how it happens.
Yeah. It makes me think of one of our previous episodes was with Jonathan Wilson Hartgrove, talking about his mentor, Ann Atwater. And one of Ann's things she would always say to people is that you need to reach out and touch people. And so what I'm hearing you say is for us privileged folks, the way to our salvation is often something that is it's getting close to something that is already coming close to us, and it's doing things small, local, and concretely. In a lot of ways, that is such a contrast. I think about the Exodus story to it is in her blood to think about scalability and how and like the empire, and like and it's often in the blood of very well-meaning, privileged Christians and otherwise to think about how our good deeds can scale, right? And her taking on infant Moses is not necessarily a scalable act. It's an act of care and concentration and limits and risk.
Well, and when you look at the whole narrative, all of these women just did. It was like a series of you start off the story with, here are the 12 men, here are the 12 sons of Jacob, which is the Hebrew way of saying these are the leaders, the 12 leaders. 12 meant that this is the leadership structure.
It's complete, that's it.
And then the narrator starts to tell you the story using 12 women. So we find out, if we have eyes to see, we find out that there's this alternative leadership structure at work. And so what these women each do, it's a series of small moves, right? The thing that's in front of them, whether it's constructing a raft and getting my child across the river, or having enough courage to step in between these two women and say, you guys can connect and do a nursemaid contract. There can be an unorthodox partnership here, or a woman picking up a baby. It's a series of small moves that moved them towards liberation. We often think of the big grand movement of them all, going across the Sea of Reeds, the Red Sea. But actually, all of these small moves, and actually over decades, right? I mean, we meet Miriam when she's an adolescent, and our best understanding of the text is she was probably in her 80s when she and her brothers danced across the Red Sea. So this is a marathon. Liberation is not quick. It's not a sprint. It is a marathon, right? But a series of small moves, long-term relationships, those were all part of the salvation story, the liberation story that we see.
I love, especially in this time in quarantine, where well-meaning folks like you and I won't say what you're feeling, but I'm feeling often so limited in my ability to do big things to help a lot of people and to flatten this curve faster. It really messes with your feeling of control. But I love how you talk about the Nile Network as a network built on neighborliness. And I would just wonder, in this quarantine time, what ways your work is so built on imagination and like leaping the gap of the text and where we are, like how you would leap the gap of what networking for neighborliness might mean for us, like during this time when we're far apart. We might still have neighbors, but we can't touch them. We can't be so close to them.
Right. I think we're still very early on in this. And so I think I've tried to give myself permission that I can't name all of those things yet. Because we're still just at the beginning. I usually do my work at a local coffee shop. I have a nice home office, and there's certain work I do here, but there's something about getting up in the morning and going out in the dark. I usually get there at like 5:30. So I get there when everything's still dark and quiet, and I come in and I greet my baristas and I get my coffee and I sit, and but there's a little neighborhood there. There's all the regulars. I live on the edge of 3 different retirement communities. So there are a lot of I'm the youngest of all the of all the regulars. They're all in their 70s and 80s, most of them. But that is my neighborhood. These are the people who I have relationship with. And as we were moving towards I saw that at some point we were going to have to be staying at home. I made sure I had everybody's, their email, their phone number, whatever. Just how else would I stay in touch with them? Because
Yeah,
we only
that's
know
right.
each other because we share a physical space and
That's
then we all
right.
go to our places. But some of it has just been in the last set of days, just calling, checking in on people. How are you doing? Do you need anything? Did your cataract surgery get postponed? Because I'm supposed to drive in, did that get postponed? What are we doing? Can I get you anything? Checking in with the couple that I normally see. Same thing. Right now, it's just checking in on people,
Yeah.
being a good neighbor in the ways that I can be. And it seems, talk about insignificant, it seems really insignificant. And I have a nice little home. And so when you're in your house and you feel, yes, I'm confined to my house, but it's a nice house
Right.
and I have the food I need and I have all the books that I need. And there's this disconnect that I've been experiencing with trying to flatten the curve and sacrifice for others. But really, I feel quite comfortable and at ease. Um, I'm still struggling through the early days of this, but I know I'm trying to be mindful of those that I can't see, my neighbors.
Yeah.
I'm trying, but I don't know what it's going to look like next week or 2 weeks from now. I'm just hoping that I have eyes to see what might be required of us, but I don't know.
Yeah. No, I don't think any of us know.
No.
I was curious. I wanted to circle way back because I missed the opportunity earlier when we were in the middle of it. But the one word that I kept underlining in this book was the word. It might not be very familiar with a lot of our listeners. It's this word pharaonic.
I knew that's the word you were going to say.
Yeah, related to Pharaoh.
Yes.
I guess I would love to hear you define that as related to Exodus, but also like what does pharaonic mean for us now, and maybe even especially in a time of COVID.
Sure.
Yeah.
Of course, Pharaoh is. We all seem to know who the pharaohs were, right? The kings of Egypt, the leaders of Egypt. Interesting for me was the recognition, and this is something when you learn these stories as a child, you see them one way, a very simplistic way, and then you come back as an adult and recognize, oh, this story has so much of the socioeconomic hints in it. You're meant to see power structures and ethnic division, and you're meant to see those things. So one of the things I learned early in my research was that Pharaoh wasn't just a title like king, that Pharaoh actually was like saying the White House, Downing Street. It was more of the apparatus, the administrative apparatus of the state. That Pharaoh, that's what Pharaoh really was. Which was interesting for me to think differently, like, oh, we're not just talking about one bad dude.
Yeah, it's a synecdoche for the whole system, right?
Exactly.
Yeah.
We're not just talking about one hard-hearted guy. We're talking about a whole system shaped by that kind of thinking. That in a sense, the whole administration has accepted and developed that one person's mindset, because that's the progression we see in Exodus. Early on in the first few verses, he's called the king of Egypt, and then it shifts. And I think that is significant because this storyteller is pretty intentional all the way through. And I think we're meant to see that his personal animosities, his personal insecurities, his personal vendettas become adopted by the state. So now all the functionaries of Egypt are implicated. And at one point, the text even says, all Egyptians become complicit.
Yeah.
And if you don't think that is a scary text, because I look at my own country and think, oh, all Americans are implicated. That includes me. I am culpable in this apparatus, in what it does to my neighbors. I am part of it. I'm not exempt.
Yeah.
And I think that's a one of the harsh truths, but also one of the gifts of Exodus is to recognize, okay, I'm in it. So now what am I going to do, right? What part am I going to play? But What we see is that Pharaoh is, in this story, he's fixated with numbers, very preoccupied with greatness, and underestimates the women. And if that doesn't sound like the pharaohs of today, I'm sorry. I could not write it any better than the narrator of Exodus.
Exodus is a major subtweet. It's
the whole story of Exodus exactly is the subtweet for this current administration. I believe that we have somebody who maybe more than most pharaohs mirrors what we see in the text. Concerned with with their ranking on Facebook and concerned with their ratings. And, you could not make this up.
In the economy, in the middle of a plague, we're thinking economy,
Right. Yeah. And historically, a lot of exegetes think that there was a lot of geopolitical insecurity at the time as well. Right. And so Pharaoh is afraid that people are going to be against me, and maybe these Hebrews are going to turn on me and join with somebody else, and I'm not going to get reelected. I mean, right, there's this insecurity that we feel in the text. So I do think that we actually have, in our own Egypt, we have our own Pharaoh. But I also think that we can talk about pharaonic forces, as in the forces that come out of the administration, the forces of deathliness. It was the command to kill, it was infanticide, to kill all the baby boys. It was policies of enslavement, right? These kinds of things that cripple communities and literally kill them. Tell me that doesn't look like family separation. Tell me that doesn't look like mass incarceration that targets colored communities. Tell me that isn't, policies that run pipelines through indigenous lands to make sure that they don't go through the rich white communities. I mean, right, there are pharaonic policies, just like there are pharaohs. And so for people who maybe are uncomfortable naming a pharaoh, can we at least agree that there are forces of deathliness?
Yeah.
And they are pharaonic, and we are meant to resist those.
That's right. And as you pointed out, Pharaoh doesn't get a name, but these women get names. And
most of them.
Many of them, right. And in some ways that really highlights and dignifies the women, but also it Pharaoh or the king is a placeholder. It's very occasionally there are good kings, but mostly whoever sits on that throne is going to inherit the
apparatus.
The apparatus, that's right.
Well, and wherever you are, could be in Egypt, right? Exodus didn't just happen. It happens. It can still happen. Yeah. We can be a part of it.
Yeah. I know you're a big Walter Brueggemann fan and student, and I can't help these days in listening to, I was listening to a 538 podcast about, stats and epidemiology, and they were quoting a epidemiologist who was saying, months from now, if this goes well and we do what we're supposed to do, you'll say that we were overreacting, and that would be a good thing. And I hear in that, this is prophetic speech. Like, this is how that works. Is like the prophets say, if you keep doing this, death and destruction and despair and divine judgment. And then just because it doesn't happen doesn't mean we were wrong. Like, there's still time.
Right.
And so, I find myself wrapped up in that imagination. Brueggemann calls it the prophetic imagination of comfort and, energizing and critique. These are wild times.
Yeah. He published on April 1st, so just 2 days ago. I don't know if you saw, he published a very simple reflection out of Isaiah.
I didn't see it.
Yeah, and it was so great to get a word from Walter in the midst of these times. And he basically talked about the newness, right? I'm doing a new thing. And he says, we're already seeing hints of the newness, because who would have thought that we would have actually started releasing nonviolent offenders from prison early? Who would have thought that we would have actually written some policies that would have actually targeted struggling families and not just the big banks? Like, he listed some of these things that
that's right.
already we're starting to see things that we didn't think were possible.
That's right.
Just a set of months ago that, there are some new things. And then he said, the text goes on to talk about the former things, right? That the former things, we won't remember them anymore. And he says, what are the former things that we hope that what things do we want to put in that category of former things that hopefully we will learn on the other side of this, and that we won't perpetuate. And it was the word I needed for this week. I have a long list of former things, things I want to see retired to history.
Well, Kelly, I think that is probably a good place for us to end today. This is such a wonderful conversation.
Yes, it was great.
So glad to that this book is out in the world and is a great contribution to scholarship and devotional reading, and it's wonderful. I love it so much. Thank you. Today's episode featured special music by Mac Matter. You can find more of that music at his Bandcamp and YouTube pages, which are listed in the show notes.
And our theme music is always The Old Arcs Moving by A.A. Gray and the 7 Foot Dilly. And then our outro music is Jesus Said by David Childers.